Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's around 3 o'clock, and after a week of Easter break, we're back with the online Hot Politics Lab, and today it's a pleasure to introduce to you Diamantis Petropoulos-Petalas, who is started April 1st, it's no joke, at the University of Amsterdam as a postdoctoral research in Gijs's ERC project. And Diamantis is a rare species in a sense that he has a real, truly multidisciplinary background, and did a PhD at Radboud University, was a postdoc at the VU, and has worked extensively with insights from neuroscience and decision making, EEG measures, till surveys and survey experiments. And we're really excited that Diamantis is joining us, or has joined us. And today he will give a first teaser at some of his previous work, but also talk about some of the ideas he has for the things he wants to do with us in the lab. So without further ado, Diamantis, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you, Bert, for the very kind words. I'm particularly excited myself, presenting the Hot Politics Lab today. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks. It's great that you're joining today's talk. So let me just share my screen so that everyone can see. That should work, or that should work. Right. So yeah, my name is Diamantis Petropoulos-Petalas. I'm from Greece, as my name I can tell. And a week ago, I started as a postdoc at the Hot Politics Lab of the Political Science Communication Science Department at the University of Amsterdam. And practically, I'm joining the team on board to work on as a connecting ring, to put it this way, between political science and cognitive neuroscience researchers. To what it's sort of becoming increasingly understood as political neuroscience or neuropolitics. So today I'll be talking about beliefs, and more specifically, I'll start by explaining some sort of broad theoretical concepts on why and how beliefs relate to cognition, and thereafter to political behavior, political cognition and behavior. I will then argue that by investigating the neuroscience of beliefs and belief systems more generally can actually be very informative for us for how specific emotional and cognitive processes underlie socioeconomic and political decision-making. And that can help us better understand human behavior in the social and the political world. I will then present some of my PhD work on how predictions about the economy shape our future behavior and can be explained by a number of psychophysiological mechanisms that are involved in this process. And finally, I'll try to sort of make a connection between these ideas and empirical findings to further and future research questions that I'll be working with together with my colleagues at the Hot Politics Lab. So in all, the title says it all, and off we go for the upcoming 29 minutes, I hope. So philosophers have referred to the idea of beliefs for quite some time now, referring to as some sort of proposition about the world being true. Ancient Greeks have used different notions for this construct, linguistic construct, namely pistis, doxa, or dogma, which in respect they refer to trust and confidence, so the pistis part. Doxa refers to opinion or acceptance of opinion, so the belief that. And dogma refers to obeying the core positions of a school of thought, to put it this way. So this is like the more hardcore sort of element of belief. In all, it sort of involves this mental representation about reality. So beliefs are thought to be these building blocks of our conscious experience, of our conscious thinking. And different schools, for example, representationalism, characterizes beliefs in terms of these mental representation, while functionalists define beliefs in terms of the function or the causal role played by them. Perceptions can cause indeed beliefs, and beliefs can cause actions. And I'll get back to this point when I'll start introducing my prior work. Other philosophers have defined beliefs as our interpretation about a given entity. With this respect, they mean that we sort of ascribe beliefs to entities or objects in order to predict practically how these will behave in future. So interestingly, beliefs are hard to change, especially when shared with others, while deficient belief updating can relate to psychopathology. So if you sort of like put these ideas together, you know, there's a strong suggestion that there is a biological basis for beliefs, which is probably half wired by 50% and learned from experience by another 50% at the very least. Indeed, I'd say that, you know, beliefs can be conceived as those crystallized opinions or fragments of knowledge, which are often poorly linked or justified, that sort of fall in between the sphere of things that could be true, so the sphere of possibilities, and the things that we think are true, so without necessarily understanding how or why. And therefore, beliefs can be seen as mental representations at higher levels of the cognitive hierarchy. And what I mean by this is that beliefs involve like a plentiful cognitive resources at more fundamental and domain general levels of cognition that seem to operate in synchrony. For example, these cognitive resources could involve networks that ascribe likelihood to entities, networks that store prior beliefs, so sort of memory networks, neural networks that register upcoming evidence from the senses, other networks that ascribe a reward on these evidence from the senses, or even other networks that code for detection error and omit error detection signals. So as a result of such complexity, beliefs can be very hard to disprove, and they're very vague and abstract. Not to mention that before they can land on things we can talk about, such political beliefs or religious belief or even pseudoscientific beliefs, these mental constructs seem to involve very basic and fundamental levels of cognition, as I said. And I think that this is exactly the reason why it's very hard to change beliefs. The brain, in fact, needs more evidence from experience to disprove existing beliefs and change decision-making behavior, and that has consequences for how we humans behave in the social world. So beliefs are thought to be a byproduct of sort of natural selection, perhaps a byproduct of the theory of mind processing, while some other researchers think that it has roots in even more fundamental processes, for example, pattern recognition, so visual pattern recognition. There's mounting evidence from neuroscience nowadays pointing to both structural and functional brain differences in how the believer's brain differs from the skeptics, for example, or where in the brain different types of beliefs are being located. For example, beliefs of doctrine, everyday beliefs, or relational beliefs can involve, again, very different networks in the brain. A very important domain general cognitive system for the updating and the maintenance of beliefs is thought to be what's so-called the predictive processing framework. This sort of framework suggests in neuroscience, it's a neuroscience framework, and it suggests that the brain acts as a predictive machinery whereby it weights neural activity in response to incoming evidence from the senses against its prior higher order beliefs, thereby emitting a prediction error signal that sort of feeds in and facilitates this updating process. This idea has its roots in the concept of the Bayesian brain, which suggests that in its nature, the brain sort of represents sensory information probabilistically in the form of distributions. I'm not going to dive like more into these neuroscientific details. I don't want to scare people off. But perhaps this is a nice book for people who are interested in this topic that I really find inspiring. And I think it's interesting because it makes a very explicit link between the biological origins of beliefs and how these translate to phenomena that involve belief systems. So far, I tried to link some theoretical ideas about beliefs to, let's put it this way, quantitative approaches of what is the believing brain, and discussed some cognitive operations that occur at the very micro level of description. Nowadays, there is in fact growing interest in looking at higher levels of explanation, somewhat higher, where these operations at the micro level land on. So if we look in this literature, we can see that the believing brain involves a series of maladaptive operations or biases, if that's perhaps a more politically correct term to use. And these operations land on concepts like, updating, motivated reasoning, cognitive rigidity, risk-taking, or a series of perceptual, emotional, and decision-making biases. So the question is, why use cognitive neuroscience to investigate political beliefs? Well, we talked about the functional differences between believers and skeptics. And on top of that, political science and neuroscience, which have been connecting for at least a decade now, they seem to suggest that liberals and conservatives think differently. They feel differently. They experience sensation differently. They process emotion, humor differently. They respond to new information differently. They have different moral foundations and different conceptions of what's justice, what's equality, what's empathy, and what's fair. So these differences can be actually explained by differences in physiology, in brain structure, and in epigenetic outcomes. Moreover, a number of existing studies have sort of indicated structural differences, not only functional, but also structural differences in the brains between liberals and conservatives. For example, we know that localized regions consistently respond to fairness and moral evaluation, and these seem to involve cortical and subcortical limbic structures, such as the anterior cingulate, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or even more deep structures like the bed nucleus, stria terminalis, and the amygdala. So in short, there's mounting evidence that suggests ideological worldviews can reflect differences in processing styles, which should be grounded in more lower level perceptual and cognitive operations. So in all, cognitive neuroscience methods can actually tell us a lot on how these lower level operations map on these higher level concepts like beliefs, like political beliefs, but also how ideological differences and socio-political or economic beliefs can steer emotion and cognition. And therefore we can use cognitive neuroscience methods or paradigms that draw from there to sort of merge the distance between phenomena that occur and we describe at the macro level of the political world to operations that occur at the micro level of cognition. So during my PhD, I want to make a bridge here to the work that I conducted for Radboud University and the Communication Science Department, whereby together with my supervisors, Paul Hendricks Hettehan and Hein van Schie, we investigated how economic beliefs translate to decision-making behavior and what sort of mechanisms, psychophysiological mechanisms, are involved in this process. Social scientists of like the last century had already suggested that beliefs can have very serious consequences, including political and economic. And there's a famous example by Robert Merton, who suggested that self-fulfilling prophecies may govern the world of economy by articulating this example about how fake news about the possible collapse of a bank led the organization to an actual bankruptcy in the end. This idea is quite appealing, actually, and if we look on what happened to during the recent socioeconomic crisis in Greece, it's not strange. It's quite familiar. So back then, individuals would even queue in front of ATMs to remove their savings from the bank, given the negative economic predictions about the future. However, this sort of idea of self-fulfilling prophecies was never actually put under empirical investigation. And that's what I did for my PhD. So we designed like 3 similar studies in which we used a modified version of an existing paradigm from cognitive neuroscience, namely the balloon analog of risk task. And this was, as I said, originally developed by cognitive psychologists to tackle the trade-off decision-making and impulsive risk-taking. Now, what happens in the task is that participants inflate a virtual analog of a balloon on the computer screen in order to increase the profit that is associated with successive inflation responses up to the size that the participant feels comfortable with. However, every decision to further inflate the balloon comes with an increasing probability of a balloon to burst. Now, in this case, there's no profit to be collected, and the participant should start all over again with inflating a new balloon. We chose this bar task because it represents with an analog, a visual metaphor, if you wish, of an economy at risk of a burst. And it actually requires no sophisticated skills in mathematics or probability theory or anything. So it's quite intuitive and easy for the participant to grasp. While participants performed in this paradigm, at a designated point, we gave them a balanced economic prediction in the form of a text message that appeared on the screen, which was very simple and read exactly as you see in the screen. Note that the experimental conditions differed only with respect to the words that are being underlined here. We used 3 studies, as I said, consecutively, starting with a behavioral one, diving to the neural aspects of the underpinnings of this behavior manifested in the task using EEG. And at the third study, we used skin conductance measures. So we used the within subjects design, we counterbalanced the order of presenting the news manipulation, and we had relatively small samples because we expected fairly large effect sizes, which indeed we found. And given that we found no order effects, it made sense to just include everyone in the within subjects comparison. So we consistently find similar sort of patterns across the 3 studies. So to start with, of course, we find that participants in the negative versus the positive expectation condition seem to modify their behavior accordingly, and that led to different profits made. We also found more interestingly, as you can see on the top right of your screens, that during a sequence of 60 balloon inflation, so 60 rounds of this sort of game, participants remained quite resilient to change their behavior. They were very unlikely to change their behavior. So they sort of complied with the instructions or the manipulation, the message manipulation that we gave them. That actually we found very interesting and we wanted to replicate. And we also found a pattern in reaction times, suggesting that as the balloon grew bigger, the risk would become larger, and therefore it would induce more anxiety to individuals. That's exactly what we found. And we found that in the case of the negative prediction, this anxiety was even more amplified. So that sort of validates our idea that these messages, at the very basic level even, they can have really steering consequences for behavior. So in study 2, we replicated the same behavioral patterns. I'm only showing the reaction time pattern here. And as I said, we also included EEG to tackle the neural underpinnings of decision-making behavior during this paradigm, the bar task. What we found different brain areas that seem to be implicated in this process. We actually found visual components to be activated already 100 milliseconds after presenting rewards to participants. We found middle line areas that usually code for a prediction error or surprise, if you wish, in the coming stimulus. And more interestingly, we found condition differences between the positive and the negative information condition in these ERPs. This was very convincing evidence for us of the what's so-called predictive framework, predictive processing framework. So as I introduced earlier, the brain seems to already code stimuli from experience on the basis of prior expectations. And we were able to tackle this process already at the range of 100 to 500 milliseconds after presenting a stimulus, which participants had a certain expectation about. So this is what these signals that I show you here practically translate to. That's the functional interpretation of it. In study 3, we used a skin conductance to tackle the sort of emotional aspect behind the pattern of results that we found in the earlier studies. We did replicate again the same pattern of results. This is the reaction times again. So again, we have like this significant difference in the two conditions. We also found, and that's quite interesting in my opinion as well. So we also found a difference in skin conductance levels at the moment that participants were actually reading the message. So what you see here is reading time. It took on average about like 8 to 10 seconds for participants to read this little message. And within that time, we saw that participants who participated in the negative condition, their skin conductance levels seemed to increase, suggesting that they experience more anxiety associated with the message. So already in view, in light of these fake news, there is emotions involved in the process of updating beliefs. And we also found a decreasing pattern of skin conductance levels across rounds, but only for the positive message condition, implying that people who participated with a more positive expectation about how the balloons would evolve in the future were playing this game at a more restful mindset, to put it this way. So across 3 studies, we practically replicated results. We found quite identical results. And we saw that beliefs can cause behavioral self-fulfilling prophecies. We saw that these sort of tendencies, behavioral tendencies, are very hard to change. So it's difficult to disprove this initial belief on the basis of evidence that comes from experience. And we interpreted that as an influence on the mental model or the mental representation of the BART economy and the emotional reality associated with decision-making in this task. We also found that this manipulation modulates reward processing of gains and losses, and it modulates the predictive processing of visual stimuli as well. Interestingly, follow-up questions would evolve the role of political ideology, I think, in risk-taking using a very similar paradigm. And if I have some more time, perhaps I'll present like this slide afterwards. But perhaps more interestingly, in the coming months, we hope to bring into life a number of projects that we want to launch together with colleagues of mine at the Hot Politics Lab, involving the concept of emotional and cognitive biases in political contexts, as well as the role of different misinformation characteristics on emotion elicitation, information selection, and information credibility. So I hope this line of work that sort of tries to bring together fundamental processes to more socio-political behavior and phenomena that we see at the macro level can serve as a solid material for merging some of this gap between the social sciences and the neurosciences. So I have this slide, since I have a few more minutes. So that would be a nice follow-up, taking from the previous study using the balloon analog of risk, where we could use a similar task to tackle risk-taking and political ideology. So in this case, we could think of the modified BART as chances of increasing probability of getting sick from being vaccinated, for example, in light of a, I don't know, like a virus epidemic. And we could use like this as a frame actually to tackle real world perceptions of risk in relation to this topic of vaccination. And we could actually compare behavior and perhaps even neural underpinnings of this behavior on the basis of political ideology differences. In this case, we could use manipulations manipulations about the risks that are associated with vaccination programs. For example, there's news about this like mutated virus and how do people respond to it. So that would be like a project we're currently working on. Another project we're working on is tries to tackle the question how individuals jump into conclusions, so how they actually make inferences and judgments on the basis of evidence from experience. And to do that, we again borrow from paradigms from cognitive neuroscience, and in this case, the bits in the jar task, which comes merely from the delusions literature in psychiatry, whereby people are given, let's say, a visual metaphor of a jar with colored marbles in it, but they can't see obviously the color distribution. They cannot see, like black and white marbles, to put it this way. And then they have to sample one after the other until they feel confident in making a decision about the majority of marbles, of colored marbles, or the distribution, if you wish, of the color marbles in the jar. So that paradigm has been used before to tackle delusions and jump into conclusion biases. And because these constructs are highly related to the political brain, or processes that take place in the political brain, we hope to tackle some aspects of political ideology, again, using lessons from neuroscience. So that's it for me. I'm open to questions. I'm very excited to receive your questions. And I want to say a big thank you to people from our lab. It seems that people are increasing and becoming more and more. So a big thank you to all of you, and a big thank you for your attention and for joining this lab presentation today.
Thanks a lot, Diamantis. Great presentation. I learned a lot. So I'm really looking forward to these projects that we're going to develop. Okay, so now back to business as usual. You can write your questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them aloud, and then Diamantis will hopefully answer. First question is from Xingyao. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question. Do you think there would be a difference between the neural basis, or maybe behaviors also, of conscious and unconscious beliefs?
Thanks for the question, Xingyao. This is already you're diving in deep, to put it this way, with your question. It's quite hard to tell, actually, until before we could have some sort of empirical understanding of how beliefs and what sort of beliefs we're talking about here. But my sort of first assumption here would be that more conscious or more aware representations of political belief, for example, ideology, would probably rest in areas related to language. Yeah, okay, you can hear me. I'm sorry. I was looking on the mute button and I thought it was pressed, but it was not. So, for instance, if you look on Wernicke's or Broca's areas, you might actually see more activity in cases where people experience consciously ideology, for example, or like other sort of beliefs. I don't know if that answers your question, or at least addresses it, like, to some extent. Hopefully it does.
If not, then Xingyao, just write a follow-up, and we'll address that. Thanks. I had a question, and Diamantis. A lot of the political neuroscience literature is focused on this distinction between liberal and conservative ideology, and coming from a context where ideology is typically conceived as multidimensional, and you yourself are from also a context where ideology is conceived as much more multidimensional than in the US. In fact, I mean, the US is also multidimensional. Anyway, what other aspects of ideology that do not pertain to the social liberal conservative dimension do you think would be relevant to study in political neuroscience?
There is a number of processes that might be interesting to tackle, I guess, in this process. So I already introduced a few during my talk. Think about fairness, think about trust more generally, think about all levels of cognition where hardcore pre-wired beliefs, so we can look on beliefs as a more general umbrella term. And if you wish, that's the sort of take-home message that I'd like to bring in with this presentation today. So in light of this more broad understanding of beliefs as a more broad system, we could think of quite a number of topics related to politics that go beyond, of course, the level of
Not sure if you can hear
Does
us.
this answer your question?
There you are. Yeah, we missed the part at the end.
Hello? Oh man.
Diamantis.
This is the VU equipment, right? That is not working.
Okay, this question was just too hard. We froze Diamantis. It's unfortunate. Our speaker just died. I'm not sure I would be able to answer the questions. I'm getting a message now from Diamantis. What's happening on a different channel? Obviously, I will just tell him you're frozen. Just bear with us for a moment. I think this will be. Oh, he says it launches again. Okay, so I think Diamantis needs to restart for a moment.
It's just enough time to open the book and find the answer, right?
Yeah. Sure, Diamantis. I mean, if you didn't know the answer, you could have just told us. You don't have to like pretend that it's not working and then pick up a book and find the answer.
There's actually an excellent app for stopping, like escaping Zooms, but that was not what I used. No, I don't know.
We just missed the very last few sentences, I think, of what you said.
Right. So I think like I introduced like a few functional differences between like believers and skeptics. And, given that like my endeavor is to sort of like my vision about belief is that it's a more general, like domain unspecific process that then manifests in like political beliefs or religious beliefs or any kind of other beliefs. I would predict that there is definitely more room to do research on that goes beyond the liberals conservatives dimensions. So partly the work that I introduced with economic expectations and follow-up decision-making behavior sort of gives an example, I guess, of how we can use cognitive neuroscience to tackle phenomena that occur at the socio-political level.
Okay.
So there are other ideas that we could look at, that we could look into. I don't know if something specific, is there something specific you want me to sort of say here? Because there could be a number of things that I could say.
I think what would be interesting to think about is that some people conceive also cultural liberal and conservative ideology as your position towards inequality.
Yeah.
Right. But we can think of inequality in different ways. I mean, we can think of it as sort of almost a traditional anthropological way, as some people have more rights or more access than others, whereas in contemporary politics, it's much more economic inequality that we talk about, right? So it's about distributing goods, and so with these two, maybe these two ways of talking about inequality are both the same in our brain, or maybe they're different. I don't know.
So there is some work showing functional brain differences between people who sort of identify with Western cultures as opposed to Eastern cultures. So that's a classic topic of research in the social sciences, I guess. But there is also like some neuroscience evidence showing that indeed people who think of, their self versus the common good and prioritizing ideas accordingly, not only behave differently, but they also exhibit different patterns of brain activity. So perhaps that's a take that fits within the what you describe about inequality. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Hey, let me get back to Xinyao for a second and then move on to the other questions we have. Because Xinyao writes in the chat that she thanks you for your answer. And she says, I read an article somewhere about how people can use learned knowledge to suppress more unconscious implicit bias, like racial bias, for example. So I was wondering if that relates to some specific neural processes.
Good thinking there. I haven't actually seen like this line of work myself. I wouldn't be surprised that knowledge can suppress. So knowledge, if you see actually knowledge as, again, a sort of belief system that could sort of superimpose in other like existing systems of belief within which racial discrimination ideas might lay at. So I wouldn't be surprised if indeed like knowledge can sort of inhibit activity that it's found to be in these cases that you refer to. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, next question is from Chris Jungerius. Could you speculate on how exactly the ERP change is involved causally in subjects' change in risk-taking behavior?
Right. So yeah, that's a fair question. So you also came back like in the reviewing process of that paper. So what we did in the study is that we started with an exploratory approach where we first identified like regions of interest practically by looking on specific time range and locations of the brain that we know that respond to events in the bar task. We know this from previous studies. So we started from there. Indeed, we identified that these were the sort of networks involved in our version of the BART. And then we looked on the difference produced in the CRPs on the basis of the message change. So I would say that the causality there lies in the contrast between the positive and the negative conditions. And because this design was within subjects, it sort of allows us to make this causal claim. If you wanted to really to take this very deep, I would definitely be in favor of replicating results in a different context, as for instance the political context or the vaccination context that I introduced briefly before.
Okay, thanks. Next question is from Matthijs Roduin. Thanks, Diamantis, and welcome to the lab. Building on Gijs's question, I have a very general question about the idea of the liberal versus the conservative brain. To what extent are, according to you, differences between liberals and conservatives the results of either biological factors or the interaction between the brain and socio-political phenomena? Are there, for instance, differences between people in multi-party systems compared to two-party systems like US or UK? This is a very long wave of Matthijs saying, welcome to a political science department.
Hi, Matthijs. Great to be on board, and thanks for your question. I think that your question really lies in between what Gijs already asked and what Xinyao asked. So yes, it's hard to really point on an exact percentage of involvement between, let's say, the hardwired biological and genetically predefined predispositions on political ideology and the more social or culturally imposed ideas. So I guess that to some extent, and there is quite some literature showing that genetics play a role there. It seems that there is this like sort of component that is like hardwired, and it really relates to, it doesn't manifest at the level of ideology until we sort of like put the words for it. So it starts manifesting at very low levels of cognitive operation systems. For example, the way that people code incoming stimuli from experience could be different as a result of subtle differences, genetic factors, and so forth. So biologically wired, to put it this way. On top of that, we could have like knowledge systems that are learned by experience or culture that sort of teach the brain how to behave more adaptively in this process of updating its prior beliefs. Whether and to what extent, this process would be, successful in the end, so that, culture wins the battle here. That's I guess an empirical question. It's still a pending question and a very motivating question for a number of researchers. So yeah, I hope that sort of addresses your question. I know it doesn't answer it, but
thanks, Diamantis. We have another question from Martin Rosema. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. I have one question that intrigues me. At some point, you refer to beliefs as an umbrella term. On the one hand, I like to use such general terms and adopt an umbrella term. On the other hand, perhaps we then use the same term for rather different phenomena. I recognize the same for the concept of emotion, where in lay people's language, we use the same word for scientifically different phenomena. Speaking about beliefs from a neuroscience perspective, would you be able to disentangle phenomena that are different while we use the same word of beliefs in our ordinary language? If so, what should be distinguished in your view? Wow, I'm really happy I'm not sitting in your chair today.
Yeah, these are really, really It's yeah. So absolutely. So like using these vague languages, especially when it comes to emotions, that's something that people understand quite differently. Even scientists actually understand it quite differently. So if you ask like neuroscientists, psychologists, and sociologists about the role of emotions and their function in everyday life, I'm sure you'll get like pretty different answers about what emotions are in the end. Myself, I have like a sociology. So I'm a sociologist by training, so I do find like your question like very interesting, and in fact, it's one of the primary reasons why I'm sort of trying to combine different scientific angles or perspectives on how to follow up on this phenomena. So in my view, I think that different methods can allow us gain insight at different levels of these phenomena, as I sort of implied with my presentation. For instance, if we look on what the brain does, like during a sort of emotion elicitation situation context, we wouldn't be able to explain exactly what's happening unless we would also have some self-reports, or unless we could like combine these like with some skin conductance data. So it seems the brain gives the first elements for like the human body to operate accordingly based on the stimuli it gets from experience. And then these sort of processes manifest in bodily reactions. One of those could be skin conductance or heart rate. So by tackling different levels using different methodologies every time, we can explain more and more and add like more in this sort of complexity of what emotions are in the end. So from a neuroscience perspective, I'd say that emotions could be characterized by more sort of approach versus avoidance contexts. From a psychological perspective, you could sort of refine this distinction between anger and happiness, which are sort of promotion emotions, as opposed to fear or distrust, which are less mobilizing emotions. So they sort of lead the person to take a step back in this case. So avoidance. And I guess like from a sociological perspective, emotions would be something that we use to, I don't know, like communicate with others, like within this world and beyond, the level of semantics. So I guess the answer is that we use these. Yes, I agree with you that we use these terms like quite differently sometimes, but in the end, we are trying to discuss like very similar phenomena from different perspectives, if you wish. And to tackle a little bit, to address a little bit your concern about the beliefs.
He has to look that up in the book.
that manifests in very different forms of belief in the end. It's because
Diamantis, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but we've lost you again. So yeah, Martin, I think your question was just too difficult. It broke Diamantis' computer. Let's wait a second again to see if he comes back. It's a good thing this is not his PhD defense. Yep, you're back.
Yeah, the funny thing is that I just don't understand where the moment is. So I keep on talking and talking and talking. And then at some point I realize that nobody's moving anymore. So I don't know if where.
You talked about beliefs already, saying that.
Okay, you heard a little bit of that part. So yes, I was just like saying that indeed beliefs are this overarching idea that actually can manifest to a number of like more specific, a number of more specific or concrete sort of ideas, such as like political beliefs or religious beliefs and so forth and so on. So the reason why I like talking about beliefs is exactly because they're so vague and they can be, manifested and translated in so many different ways. I don't know if that sort of helps you understand my angle a little bit more. I share the concerns with you.
Yeah, well, it's at least it's honest that you say that the vagueness is actually helpful in this case. That that helps. Yeah. Bert has a question.
Yes, thanks, Diamantis. So it's going to be a bit of a political science question, but in understanding what beliefs are, quite some political scientists argue that many people might not have a very structured belief system, and that it's only the people who are really sophisticated in politics that they know how to construct a coherent set of beliefs. How does that relate to the neuroscientific perspective on beliefs, where it seems to suggest that it's a universal tendency of people that they can do it? So does that say to the sophistication literature, political sophistication literature, which argues it's only the sophisticated, that it's a matter of motivation? Or are there maybe structural differences that maybe inhibit some people to just form coherent beliefs?
It's a great question, Bert. Thanks. So I guess the answer will be quite similar, like with the answers I already tried to give to other questions. So if I get this right, you're asking how political sophistication plays in, and to what extent the sort of universality or biological origins of beliefs juxtaposed to this political sophistication. I think that, if you really ask me, I think that the more sophisticated one is, the less likely that they have very rigid cognitions about things in the world. That's, of course, like my own assumption, my own speculation, or based, obviously it's an educated guess, but it's not like a result of empirical research whatsoever. It's sort of my understanding of literature. So I think that cognitive rigidity or cognitive flexibility might be terms that are quite important here in order to understand this interplay. I'd say that political sophistication, or like knowledge, more broadly speaking, is what sort of allows the brain to be more flexible and more adaptive to different situations, politically speaking, right? So I would argue that those who exhibit more rigid or more like conservative views would be indeed people who have more less, a tendency to be less open for new experiences. And I think that there's also some work showing correlations between such personality traits and political sophistication in this case.
Okay, Diamantis, I think this question is nicely complementary to the next question from Jordan Mansell from Western University in Canada. So good morning to you, Jordan. For your upcoming research on belief and risk, what mediating and moderating factors are you planning to control for? For example, tolerance of uncertainty?
Yeah, this is a very good question. We were also sort of toying around with this answer together with the group of people we work with on these projects now. Tolerance for uncertainty could be indeed like one interesting factor. We are thinking about employing indeed like measures for cognitive rigidity or flexibility controlling for those. Political sophistication, I guess, goes without saying. I don't know, I guess impulsivity would be another interesting thing to look into. Yeah, if you have any more suggestions, please, Jordan, thank you for your question. And I'd be very happy to hear if you have more thoughts. Please feel free to contact me as well. I'd be very happy to share ideas with you.
Yeah, and yeah, you can also type that into the chat box if you like, Jordan. Thanks. Now, the amount is just sort of a practical question, since most of the people listening in have never conducted EEG studies. Having myself some experience with psychophysiology, it's really a lot that you need to learn, but also there are a thousand ways of actually conducting these studies. Could you give a couple of quick pointers as to, if you would want to conduct an EEG study, what should people think of? What should people read?
Well, beyond the sort of like practicalities that relates to the equipment and understanding what you're doing with like coding. So for instance, like coding would be one practical example. I think that it's quite important for the researcher who is interested in employing such methods to be able to code a little bit in programming languages such as MATLAB, for instance, or Python. So starting from there might actually help a lot. Another very important thing in designing and launching EEG studies would be to carefully think of specific time ranges that you're interested at, and carefully mark these time ranges in the raw EEG signal so that you can derive your areas of interest, to put it this way. Beyond that, I guess it's just practice and experience. It helps a lot to give very clear instructions to participants in the lab, because usually these type of measurements take a lot of time, and that can induce some sort of distress, like to the participant or so. So it's good to inform people up front about that and sort of help them help you obtain better quality data. That's something that I keep on stressing to my colleagues and students and so forth. It has helped a lot, like in my own research. And carefully think about experimental time. I guess that's one of the most important things to consider. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Bert has one more question. Bert?
Sorry, I was a bit slow. Yeah, thanks, Diamantis. Maybe, yeah, I'm going to ask the theoretical question. Back to the knowledge sort of component. There are two competing models basically at the moment in the political science, political psychology literature. One suggests that, well, actually Dan Kahan would say, well, it's the more sophisticated, those that can think better, that they would be motivated to defend their beliefs, and actually would counter to what you say would be the sort of the more objective. Other people have said, like Finn Arsenault said, well, it's actually when people don't have a very strong attachment to politics, then their knowledge drives them to be more objective and more flexible, as you described. Mm-hmm. Tabor Lodge and also some of the work I've done suggests that it's actually people who are highly invested in politics and an effective attachment that are the people that are the most motivated to be rigid. So could some of the neuroscientific tools help us tackle where we are in the observational world, or the survey experiments are trying to theorize about cognitive mechanisms while not directly capturing them? And if so, do you have ideas of how we can do this? It's an easy question to end the afternoon, right? You don't have to turn off your screen.
It's fantastic. I guess convergence of these methods is what helps in increasing understanding of these complex phenomena. So once you are able to, I don't know, start with laboratory studies, for instance, or survey studies from observation, and bring the principles of these observations into testing, scrutinous testing, might enable you to, I don't know, to tear apart between those groups, as you suggest with your question. I'm not sure how I can theoretically answer this question adequately at the theoretical level. I guess I guess there's no, I don't think that there's like a golden standard in what kind of methods could be used to help us, sort of tell apart between these groups of people. I think it's just at the point that we are now at least, I think it's still, at the level of, observing correlations, see where the trends lie at, try to control for confounding variables and so forth. And only then we'll be able to actually dive into like core hypothesis testing and studies that tackle these kind of tests, hypotheses.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's so maybe one last question before we round off. If you look in the coming years, what part of the research process will be the most challenging in terms of applying these methods and this agenda that you're rolling out here?
Well, if I'm very honest, the way I see things going now, I guess, the whole pandemic is what poses the biggest challenge at the moment, and actually bringing people in the lab for conducting such studies. So that's definitely like one big thing to easily.
If Hugo de Jong is listening to this widely attended podcast, then we should let him know that he should get his vaccinations in order. Students can come in early.
I think it's a good idea. Although there, you might miss out, because would the skeptics take the vaccination to then join the lab? Yeah. So, and that's actually, that sort of gives out the answer to your question. So in general, making it to have a representative sample is quite an endeavor, I think, when it comes to such like sensitive populations, because indeed, like by sort of definition, skeptics, or like very hardcore skeptics, because we as scientists could think of ourselves as being skeptics sometimes, and that's a good thing. But I'm talking about the more the less flexible brains, right? So these people are harder to persuade that research is for some sort of common good, for increasing common understanding and knowledge, and that actually is of benefit for us. So I'd say that this is also a sort of a challenge that the political researcher should be aware of, regardless of whether you're looking on neuroscience or like on survey designs. Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, Diamantis. This is I really enjoyed this afternoon, and I'm sure that the people listening in have had a good impression of the things you've worked on and what you want to work on. And I can only say that, and I'm sure I speak for Gijs and the people listening, that we are very excited to see what this will bring in the coming years, right? Like all these studies on innovation show that diversifying teams lead to potential breakthroughs. And I'm very excited about what will come in the times ahead of us. That said, we also have a couple of speakers in the coming weeks. Next week, Friday, Teresa Koen from the Political Science Department at the University of Amsterdam will present work that does not yet have a title. April 23rd, Liz Connors from the University of South Carolina will give a talk titled Partisan Social Pressure and Effective Polarization. And then we are already at the last Friday of the month, April 30th. Then Tobias Wiedmann will give a talk titled How Renewable Energy Divides Politics, the Impact of Wind Turbines on Moral, Emotional Language in Political Discourse. And Maaike Homan will give a talk with a to-be-announced title. Then we have a little break because there's all sorts of school holidays and religious holidays. And then May 21, we have Cameron Brick, who is an expert on in social psychology, working also on sort of environmental communication related topics. And then June 4th, so mark your calendars, we have Loes Aldering from the VU, who will obviously talk about the gender dynamics in politics. So a lot to like, and I want to wish you all a pleasant Friday afternoon, and see you all next week when Teresa will present some of her work. All right.
European identity. That's the topic.
Oh, European identity. Yeah. Just European identity?
I guess something more, but that will be the overarching.
European identity and or explaining European identity. We'll have to see what comes. Regardless, that is important, and we look forward to that. So tune in next week, Friday, and we'll see you hopefully there. All right, bye-bye.